Jess, hopefully you can beam in Mark Sobel. We've got 3 or 4 minutes now, which I think you'll find rather interesting, with the former Deputy Secretary to the Treasury in the US, who's going to talk to us very briefly about Janet Yellen's trip to China. Mark used to work with Janet, knows her well, and has just written an article for OMFIF about the trip to China. So thank you, Mark, for joining us. Sorry we're starting a little late. Great to have you with us. Tell us what you expect from this, briefly, Mark, from this trip of Janet's to Beijing.
Thank you for having me, John. It's great to be here with you and celebrate the 247th anniversary of our nation's Declaration of Independence from your country and your former countrymen.
Congratulations, Mark.
So look, obviously, in a nutshell, there's much tension in the U.S.-China relationship. The dialogue's been lacking across the board. That's clearest in the military, the defense realm, etc. But it's also true in the economic space, which is quite a contrast for me, given that in the Bush and the Obama era, there was a huge engagement with China. I view Janet Yellen's trip to China as highly positive. It's a chance for her to meet some of her counterparts in Beijing at the higher level, that people that don't travel as often as the central bank and the finance ministry would to G20 meetings where she can see them. I think this will give a dialogue a boost. I also attach significance to the person of Janet Yellen going, in the sense that I think she's fairly well recognized as a former academic, a Fed chair, a technocrat, and isn't seen as a polarizing political figure. But let's not be naive. The relationship is difficult. There are many difficult issues on the docket. A trip is not going to solve these problems. I don't expect breakthroughs or significant deliverables, but at least the fact that they're talking will hopefully turn down the temperature.
You think then, Mark, there's a slight warming of the relationship after perhaps a tricky period, not helped, I suppose, by the isolation we talked about earlier as a result of the COVID time, for example?
I think there's a slight warming, or maybe they often refer to it as trying to put a floor on the relationship. But again, I think it's a very fraught relationship. I think the Chinese perceive that the U.S. is trying to contain China and is resentful about China's rise. I think they perceive the economic relationship that on our side as being characterized by harsh rhetoric, unfair competition from China, which has some truth. They're going to be worried about proliferating sanctions, semiconductor chip actions, entities list, CFIUS role, friendshoring, meaning diversifying supply chains out of China, de-risking really being a euphemism for decoupling. And again, they know from our media that the U.S. is working on outbound investment restrictions, and surely the blocking of Russian assets got their attention. We've got beefs with their side, even apart from national security issues about excessive statism, subsidies, and the like, IPR, theft, forced tech transfers, rule of law. So I don't think Yellen is going to change any minds in Beijing about the overall relationship, or vice versa. But again, at least they're talking, and hopefully that will increase understanding a bit on both sides.
You worked, Mark, previously on a working group level with your counterparts at PBOC and elsewhere in China, and seem to have a good and productive relationship. Are those relationships still ongoing despite the recent difficulties, to your knowledge?
So my sense is that the depth of the relationships is not there. You know, I used to be able to email people in China, same for others in Treasury. We had the strategic economic dialogue followed by the strategic and economic dialogue, and we had very intense, robust discussions, a lot of meetings in G20 forum. So I don't think that's going on, but I would emphasize that the PBOC people I met over time were extremely talented, many of them educated in the United States, understood America. The engagement was at the technical level. We took a technical approach to issues. So I think I think that there's still some of that sentiment there among the financial teams.
To what extent would you regard the approach to China in the US as bipartisan at a time when practically nothing is bipartisan in the States? To what extent is it party political, the relationship with China, would you say?
I think the political rhetoric is pretty harsh across the spectrum, and definitely tough. I would say this is one area where the political class in the United States is fairly well aligned.
It's an $800 billion relationship between the two countries, and I don't think even if there were a decoupling, it's something that could happen quickly. But to what extent do you think that that Janet agrees with this idea of friendshoring and the types of, I suppose, protectionism that you just referred to?
So I think that the pandemic showed that we had built supply chains for just-in-time perfection. I think that the pandemic showed that more resilience in supply chains was needed. I think you're absolutely right. There's still plenty of business to be done between China and Europe and the US. So I don't see the threats to globalization that others see. And again, if something moves out of China, moves to Vietnam, is that really a loss for globalization? But I think there's definite national security concerns in the US, and national concerns are always going to triumph over economics. So I don't think we can dismiss the seriousness with which the U.S. and the Secretary have talked about friendshoring.
In terms of Janet's personality and her approach to the talks, what do you think her style will be, and which of the issues you mentioned will be the ones that are at the top of her mind, do you think?
Well, I'm sure she will take her intelligent, technical focus. She'll bring the issues, some of the issues that the administration wants her to raise, such as human rights, which are not necessarily a typical thing for the Treasury. But again, I think, first of all, the overall relationship, which I just described, I think macroeconomics are going to be key. The US and China are 40% of the world economy. US economy is holding up. It's slowing, but there's some resilience due to labor market. And we've got the Fed tightening. You see in China, the upswing isn't as big as expected. So you see the PBOC trying to pursue somewhat more accommodative policies. You see a divergence in the monetary stances developing, which is causing the RMB to decline. I think that's going to raise issues in the US about what does this mean for global growth, and will China be absorbing more demand from abroad in support of its external sector, and could that lead to discord? We've got the recent debt deals. As you know, China is now frequently a dominant creditor, and there's been some progress in Zambia, but what Zambia means for the future is one thing. I think the Chinese often perceive that the US takes a debt trap diplomacy perspective on China's lending abroad. I hope Yellen will be able to persuade them that our interest is in helping low-income countries. It's not about stigmatizing China. I imagine global governance issues will also arise, issues about should China have a higher role in the IMF, where to go on MDB reform and the push to expand the balance sheet leverage to support climate objectives, and will there be support for general capital increases in the institutions? So far, there hasn't been an interest. So I think they actually have a lot of substantive issues to talk about, but the overall relationship, I think, will be the key force shaping the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Mark. At least sounds like there's a constructive conversation in prospect. You've written about this trip for OMFIF as US chair, and indeed about these debt issues more broadly. So perhaps anyone would like to check that out online with us at OMFIF, do check out Mark's article. Mark, thank you very much, and enjoy celebrating separation from the British Crown for the rest of this evening.
that's a long time preoccupation of mine, but I wish you all a successful conference as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for tuning in.